the interior part of the Parthenon was non-existent, completely destroyed, and all the frieze that was going around that part of the temple was scattered all over the plateau. Some pieces even below the plateau of the Acropolis.
And by the time Elgin came into the view, it was all, I think so already 70 years had passed since then, wasn't it, or something?
Way more, actually.
Oh, really? Yeah.
130. Yeah, 130
Oh, wow.
a year. The Parthenon becomes prey for everyone. People in the garrison start breaking up the marble to make mortar. We are used to see the Parthenon and the Acropolis now with just basically a bare plateau with two big buildings and nothing else.
Yeah.
But actually, it was like a small town on top of the rock. So there were countless buildings, small houses for the garrison, each one of the people of the sergeants and the commanders, and they had their own family, their own harem. It was, there was like 200, 300 houses on top of that. And all of them were built with mortar that had been sourced by breaking up and marble sculpture. So that's what happens then, and also there were all the visitors, all travelers that get all souvenirs, pieces of marbles, one with a leg, one with a face, one with a hand, etc. That were also again scattered over there. We know that this was still going on at the time of Elgin because, for example, if you go into the Elgin room right now, the Divine Gallery in the British Museum, you will see that there are two blocks that are adjoining with one figure that goes across both blocks that has been chiseled out. We know that figure because 10 years before Elgin took those marbles, French consul Louis Fauvel made a cast of that particular block. In the space of 10 years, that figure had already been broken. And there are other bits and pieces where we have sketches from travelers and we try to find and make sense of them nowadays, and the pieces are just gone.
Yeah.
And some of these decay was going on even after Elgin. There was, for example, Byron. As soon as Byron goes to visit Athens 10 years after Elgin. He, at a certain point, he says in a letter, okay, we went with John Galt up on the Acropolis, and we went back some days after, and some pieces of the cornice of the Parthenon had fallen down in the meantime. So it's a process that is ongoing, and we know that even after Elgin, these pieces would have encountered the same fate.
Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the World of Momos podcast. And on this episode of Reflections and Reactions, we have Dr. Mario Trabucco della Torretta with us. And he's going to talk about Elgin marbles, whether they should be going to Greece or should not be going back to Greece, and the history around that. So hi there, Mario. How are you?
Hello.
Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Absolutely, thank you very much. And lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
So now, before we jump into talking about Elgin marbles, we'll first ask Dr. Mario to tell us a bit about his, sort of his background, maybe some interesting anecdotes from his time at the uni and stuff like that, and his work. Yeah.
So I started my training in archaeology very early in a way, because even before uni, I was very fixated with archaeology. I actually wanted to become an Orientalist and an Egyptologist in particular. As you do when you want to be an archaeologist, obviously, you don't think about classical antiquity as your first bet. You just go, Indiana Jones, Egyptology, and things like this. So I started learning hieroglyphs, and I wanted to go and study Egyptology, but there was no Egyptology in my hometown, in the University of Palermo in Sicily. And therefore I started becoming a little bit of an Orientalist in terms of Mesopotamia, Assyrians, Babylonians, that kind of stuff. I've done as much as I could, but again, there was very little because obviously, when you live in Sicily, the archaeology there is all Greek and Roman. Therefore, obviously, that's the bulk of the formation that you get. And so, little by little, I started becoming a classicist. By trade and by name. I started working on a site that we, as a university, have a mission in that is called Himera, the site of a famous battle between Carthaginians and Greeks in 480 BC. And then the city was basically destroyed completely in 409 BC, and you don't find much, to be honest. Sometimes it was a site that is rewarding for many aspects, but whenever you think about archaeology and you say, okay, yes, I'm digging this fantastic destroyed city, I'm gonna find the riches beyond belief and whatever. No, since the site was progressively abandoned, they took away everything that they could before leaving. So you find a little bit of broken pottery here, a little bit of a fallen roof still in place in another room, etc., etc. So, but yes, great experience overall. And I started working on architectonical terracottas. So, the ancient temples are especially in archaic age, whenever they were not made of stone or precious materials like marble, they would be made of bricks and of a stone foundation. And then they would have a crowning all over the roof of architectural terracottas, all beautifully painted, fantastic motifs, and beautiful sculptures on the acroteria. And so I studied those from Himera for my dissertation, both in BA and MA. And then I moved to Athens because I won a fellowship there at the Italian Archaeological School. And it was a national competition. So every year they take only 3 people and from all over Italy. And you go there and you study there 3 years and a half. So I lived in Athens in the school, and it was fantastic. I loved it, and I started getting. So I went there in 2006. So I was still 25 when I went there. Yeah, and stayed all the way up until 28. So and it was beautiful living there. I was the Italian Archaeological School is in a road, Odos in Greek, that is called Odos Parthenonos, because is the road that ends up with the Parthenon. So if you look up the street, you're in the middle of the street, and you look through the street, you have the Parthenon, the corner of the Parthenon showing up on top. It was amazing. If you are an archaeologist and you basically live there for 3 years, and every time you go to buy milk and then do the shopping, etc., and then you look up and see the Parthenon over there, it's something. It's definite. And I was going for a stroll around the foot of the Acropolis, and one thing that is fantastic is that you get they give you a deltion, which is a special permit from the Ministry of Culture, and you can enter freely in all archaeological sites, because obviously you're a student of archaeology, so it's a good thing to have. And I would just go and go up to the Acropolis, even if it was just to clear up my mind on something, and the landscape there is fantastic. Or other little things like this. For example, there is a terrace of the school on top of the building that is face to face with the Acropolis, and therefore imagine like full moon, Parthenon all illuminated, and you in the middle of July that are having this nice little meal on the terrace. So it's beautiful. But also the very great thing is that basically when you go to Athens and you study archaeology, you find in Athens all sorts of archaeological schools from all the major studying countries. And therefore, you get into a network where, okay, there is this event, the American school, there is this lecture of the Nordic school, and we go, and the guys from the Spanish school come over because we do a lecture. And you get this very interesting cosmopolitan microcosm of archaeologists from all over the world, united by, obviously, the passion for classical archaeology. And it's a thing that in spirit is intriguing. It's something that I enjoyed very much. Then I moved over to Sicily, back to Sicily again for my PhD. Because I won a fellowship at the University of Messina. And there I studied something very weird, that is the market weights of Athens.
Wow.
Yeah, a very everyday kind of object, and there's plenty of them scattered all over Europe. I made a catalog for my PhD dissertation of like more than 2,000 of them. And the interesting thing is that basically there was a thing like inflation in antiquity, and but the coinage of Athens was like the dollar of antiquity, something that was appreciated by everyone. Everyone would accept drachmas from Athens because they were pure silver. They were very much valued, and they had they were a very solid currency. They would not devalue, and therefore, whenever you have inflation, what happens? That you have the value of things and the price. In normal inflation, things get devalued, and you need more money to buy them.
Yeah,
they couldn't touch the money, and therefore, what happens is that you touch the other side of the equation. You touch the pieces, the weights and the measures. So, for the same amount of money, you would get more or less quantity, but the quantity will have still the same name. So it's a weird concept, but studying
it's very interesting.
These...
It's a very interesting concept because it doesn't change the value of the money, but what you get for the same money, that changes, which in principle is the same thing that happens now. It's just that we have more power to create money, so we do it by money.
Exactly, but in back in the day, what you would have is basically I'm buying for 1 drachma 1 mna of bread, but that mna of bread would be a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger, according whether or not we are in a fluctuation, in a good side, in the peaks or in the troughs of the economic cycle. And studying all of these, basically, I tried to track this kind of inflation and these movements across the economy of Athens, the political economy of Athens, from the 6th century BC to the 2nd century BC. And it's been a roller coaster, but it's been an interesting ride. And again, I studied, for example, materials here at the British Museum, the Altes Museum in Berlin, the Louvre. I wandered around Europe following these weights everywhere, almost everywhere. And so this is more or less my general trajectory in terms of my formation as an archaeologist. So it's a bit archaeologist, a bit historian in a way, because I ended up doing political history and social and economic history for my PhD, but from a very solid archaeological formation. And these gave me a little bit of an understanding of the relationship between the longue durée kind of history, the big phenomena, the social phenomena, and the life of everyday people, and how does these interconnects and overlaps with the big history, the one of the so-called histoire bataille, the history of the big happenings and the big wars and the big people.
Let me ask you within that, because there's something that I was thinking about. In the world today, we have a lot of specializations. People just go into a specialization, and then because of that, they don't have a holistic view of the things that connect those specializations. So it is actually beneficial, I think, so to have this complex a combination of different subjects, relating subjects, and then studying them together. Do you
Yeah.
feel like this is something that we are losing, like to become specialist?
Yeah, in a way, yes, because obviously it's now impossible to have people like August Beck or the big savants that you would have in the 1800s or the early 1900s
Mm.
even, that would cover the entire breadth
Yeah.
of the archaeological spectrum. You would have a professor that would be teaching Oriental archaeology and classical archaeology, and maybe even go as far as pre-Columbian, all in one seat. This is no longer tenable because obviously
Mm.
there's been such a boom in the study. In
Mm.
the studies and in the production of literature that you really need to know if you want to call yourself a specialist of something,
Mm.
that is it's now impossible to have this kind of encyclopedic knowledge
Mm.
of everything. And this obviously means that you have to make sacrifices and say, you know what, okay, I am an archaeologist, but I know nearly nothing about pre-Columbian civilizations.
Mm.
Okay, but on the other side, I know about marketplace,
Yeah.
oh no, in Athens, in the 6th century BC. And yes, I tried all the time to try to kind of balance out this problem by keeping myself busy with many other things at the same time.
Mm.
So, for example, in the moment when I was studying marketplace and political economy of Athens, at the same time I was writing articles on an Hellenistic fountain and the sculpture of the Hephaestion.
Mm.
So it's
Yeah.
not to lose in a way the contact
Yeah.
with the other side of
Yeah.
archaeology. So you don't become too forced into a niche.
Mm.
Or while I was doing colonial Greek archaeology at the university, I was also excavating in a Paleo-Christian catacomb
Mm.
next to
Mm.
Palermo, which was a very interesting experience. And I have an anecdote for you on that. There was it was 2001 at the time, and obviously there was 9/11. Everybody remembers what they were doing on 9/11. And I do as well because we were excavating this catacomb. And this catacomb was deep below ground, so obviously there were no phones and no smartphones that could
Mm.
actually take any signal. And we would enter the catacomb at 7 in the morning and leave at 4:30 in the afternoon.
Mm.
And during that time, we would basically live underground, so there was no connection whatsoever with the outside world. So we come out on the day from the catacomb at 4:30, and our phones start buzzing, and we start getting very weird reports of these
Mm.
massive things that had happened in the
Mm.
US. What we thought was that we were being pranked, because
Uh,
obviously
uh,
we were the perfect target for a prank.
yeah.
We were cut off from the civilization,
Yeah.
and it was very easy to make a fool out of ourselves. And so we started getting this information, and we said, okay, no, wait, this must be a prank. It
Mm.
cannot be possible. It's too big. And phone your grandma, ask her, because she must not be into the prank, or phone somebody else that you don't hear from, like for months.
Yeah.
So and you can ask them. And we were getting obviously confirmations,
Mm.
and obviously these hit home really hard
Mm.
whenever we ended up going back
Yeah.
at home after an hour and a half of
Mm.
coach
Mm.
traveling, etc.
Mm.
And we were in front of our televisions. But yeah, there was this very surreal atmosphere for the
Mm.
very first half an hour, 1 hour,
Yeah.
when we came out completely cut off from the
Yeah.
world, and this hit
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
So things that can happen in a Paleo-Christian catacomb.
Yeah. Yeah. So where your journey took you from there then?
From there, I basically was impacted in a way from the international monetary crisis, at the tail end of it, because this created an economic crisis also in Italy, and one of the first things that they started cutting was academia. And therefore I was in a position where either I would have to wait for a long time for turnover to be put back as it was.
I actually forgot that time, what followed through that, because I remember I was I think like 15, 16 or something. After a year or so of that, like I had a book of poetry or something that I had written and was accepted by a publisher within America, and I was like pretty young for it and stuff, and then they dropped out because of this.
Okay.
That happened because they weren't in a financial position and stuff, and
Of course.
they couldn't market or anything like that. And I just remembered that as you were saying. It's like, that was,
Yeah, it was a weird time, and
uncertain time.
so meantime I got married, so obviously I started having also responsibility on that side, and therefore I started being in a position where I couldn't become an archaeologist in the academic sector in Italy, and in Italy there is no private sector of archaeology. There is a
Oh,
bit
really?
now, but there wasn't back then. Everything in terms of archaeology is done through the state, so it's either academic archaeology or is basically the Ministry of Culture through its peripheral branches that manage it, or you get into a museum, which is also public, and there are private museums, but they are very few and far between. And because of this, I basically had nothing to do for a while, and so I started kind of recycling myself, reinventing a career in marketing. In the meantime, using transferable skills, and so being reasonably good with computers and knowing how to put a couple of words one after the other reasonably well, and therefore I kind of had a future. And knowing languages, that was one of the things that kind of saved me, because I made a little bit of a period in Germany as well, trying to get into academia there. Was a bit difficult because of the language, because yes, I know a bit of German, but not at the level to kind of do academic lectures, things like this.
I mean, you can talk with people, but
yeah, exactly. I can go and do the shopping, and I can read very easily academic writing in German, etc. And I still hear I still watch the news every now and then in German.
Just to keep yourself
keep it current. To keep it current, exactly. And so at a certain point I had to come back, and then in this situation I just started writing to all my friends around and say, okay, I need to come out of here. Find me whatever, even night porter in a hotel, I don't care, I just need to come out. And that's how I ended up in Britain. And I ended up doing something entirely unrelated, but which was based on languages. And then I ended up into the whole online advertising world, which is the industry I still work in today, which pays way more than academia would, and therefore now I do. I live these two parallel lives, where on one side I work in marketing and advertising, and on the other side I keep being an archaeologist, which is what I still feel passionate about. So and that's how I also ended up being embarked in this crusade, because I was working at the Independent newspaper a few years back.
Before that, you should tell people like your position on it, because we haven't discussed that. What's your position on the Elgin marbles?
Yeah, I'm definitely against the repatriation of the Elgin marbles, and then we can go into why the Greeks say what they say, and why I'm against what they say, etc. But yes, generally speaking, my interest has always been towards this kind of mechanics of repatriation claims and ideological constructs, etc. But I wasn't taking much of a side in private conversation. I would say I was not in favor of it, but it wasn't a big thing in my agenda in a way. Then there was a moment when, at the end of 2022, the museum of my hometown of Palermo, which had a fragment of the Parthenon, a teeny whiny, a very small one, the so-called Fagan fragment, decided to give it to Athens.
Okay.
And that's where I started. No, okay, this can't be. I really need to look into it. I'm really against. I'm really angry. I really want to do something about it. And I started writing a couple of articles for the newspaper for which I was working. For the Independent. And from one thing, another came, and then I was interviewed by a couple of TV stations and a radio interview, and then writing for the Critic, and this started becoming a thing in a way at national level. My only claim to fame in a way from a national perspective. And I started looking into it properly, and now I am in the position where I can talk about it freely, and I am also writing a book about it.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah,
because there's so much to untangle and so much to discuss, so many aspects, and happy to go into all of them. That really requires a proper tractation.
So that's a very, very, very interesting journey, but also it gives you a wide berth of sort of perspective as well, of not just being in archaeology now as well, like being on the side of marketing as well, and even within your the academic journey as well, taking different paths as well. So before, I don't know if everyone knows about the history of the Elgin marbles, why they call the Elgin marbles, and so maybe like we can briefly touch on that if you can explain to people, but like a sort of like a short burst.
Very, very bullet point in a way.
Bullet points.
So Lord Elgin was a diplomatic. Was a diplomat, and he was basically already working as diplomat in many other European capitals. And at a certain point, he gets offered the post, very important post of British ambassador at the court of the Sultan in Constantinople. Then he goes there, and while he's going there, his architect, Thomas Harrison, says, while you are going there, why don't you take an opportunity to actually make it as a scientific mission as well? And you document the antiquities there, of which we know not so much.
And
so
this time, that part of Greece was under the Ottoman Empire. So
yes,
just so people
Greece
have
was
that
a province of the Ottoman Empire, yes, and it wasn't a thing in terms of geopolitical entity. There were Greeks living in the Morea, in Epirus, and in Thessaly, in all of these areas, but there was no such thing as Greece. Then what happens was that he thinks about this and says, okay, I'll put it to the government. The government says, no, we don't want to pay for it right now. We don't have the money because obviously we are in the very middle of the Napoleonic Wars. Let's not forget. And therefore they were spending on military expenditures prevalently. And he said, okay, you know what, I think it's worthy. I'll finance it and I'll spend my money on it. He assembles a crack team of artists. This goes to Athens, and this goes to Athens, and they find that the Parthenon was in a state and was crumbling down, so much so that they couldn't even recognize some of the bits and pieces from the previous publications that they had. The most famous of which was the Antiquities of Athens by Stuart Revet, published in the one particular volume in 1762. And so they go there and say, "Oh, we need to do something," and they write to Elgin. Elgin corresponds to Lugieri. Giovan Battista Lugieri was the painter who was the chief artist in charge of the entire artistic expedition, and the mission had started only for taking drawings, measurements, and casts, and becomes something else because Elgin says, "Okay, why don't we ask for the pieces themselves? Because they are not caring for them. They are crumbling down. In 50 years' time, there's not going to be anything else to look at, and therefore we need to save them." They ask for a permission. And they get this permission from the Kaimakan. The Kaimakan is the third in command in a way. There's the Sultan, there's the Grand Vizier. When the Grand Vizier is away, because in this case he was in Egypt fighting the French, obviously the deputy Grand Vizier, which is called the Kaimakan, becomes the most senior official, Ottoman official. And he gives a letter of permission, and sends it to Athens with Lord Elgin's secretary, Reverend Hunt, and an imperial messenger. This imperial messenger is charged with giving this letter to the governor of Athens and the chief justice of Athens, so the voivode and the Cadi. And so is the official, this messenger is also the official that is charged to make them clear that they want these orders from central government to be obeyed. So of this permission, we know that there was the Turkish original because one person, John Galt, sees the original and says as much. But this has gone lost, and then we still have a translation, an Italian translation, which Reverend Hunt made the translator of the embassy provide. Why? First of all, because the translation was in Italian, not in English. Why? Because the anarchists were Italian, and because Italian was the lingua franca of the time and the place in the Levant in general. The merchants used to speak Italian, and even people like Ottoman governors. We know that Ali Pasha spoke Italian, for example. So it was like English is for now, and. So they get this translation done because they wanted to be sure of what was written in it. They couldn't read Ottoman Turkish, of course. Yeah. They go to Athens with this permission. They get anything they wanted, as per the letter of the Ferman, which said that quite clearly in two places that if they wanted to take away any pieces of stone with figures or inscriptions, no opposition be made thereto. Therefore, they are empowered with this very, very ample permission, and they use it by taking away all these sculptures. They take away some of the metopes, they take away pedimental sculptures, not all of them, and they also take away a big portion of the frieze. They take away the big portion of the frieze from the floor, from the ground, because let's not forget that the Parthenon was not a whole building. At this moment in time, the Parthenon was a ruin because it had survived antiquity by its conversion into a church. Then ended up being a Catholic church, then ended up being a mosque after the Ottoman conquest in 1458, and then probably it had gone down in usage, and the whole of the Acropolis had become a military fortress, and the Parthenon was used to store gunpowder. There was one of the usual conflicts between the Ottomans and the Venetians, and what was called by the Doge Morosini a fortunate shot ended up, a mortar shot ended up ballooning straight into the Parthenon, ignited the gunpowder there, and made one of the most remarkable pre-nuclear explosion on record. and killed 300 people in the garrison, scattered marble everywhere, opened up the Parthenon in two, and left it as a wreck, a ruin. It was left with only the east and the west part standing, and the long side, the middle, were completely opened up. And so the interior part of the Parthenon was non-existent, completely destroyed, and all the frieze that was going around that part of the temple was scattered all over the plateau, some pieces even below the plateau of the Acropolis.
And by the time Elgin came into the view, it was all, I think so already 70 years had passed since then, wasn't it, or something around that time when Elgin since that explosion.
Way more, actually.
Oh, really? Yeah.
130. Yeah, 130 years. So what happened then was then obviously the Parthenon becomes prey for everyone. The people in the garrison start breaking up the marble to make mortar, to build, because we are used to see the Parthenon and the Acropolis now with just basically a bare plateau with two big buildings and nothing else.
Yeah.
But actually, it was like a small town on top of the rock. So there were countless buildings, small houses for the garrison. Each one has of the people of the sergeants and the commanders, and they had their own family, their own harem. And it was there was like 200, 300 houses on top of that. And all of them were built with mortar that had been sourced by breaking up and grinding marble sculpture, which was in abundance over there. And so that's what happens then. And also there were all the visitors, all the travelers that get all souvenirs, pieces of marbles, one with a leg, one with a face, one with a hand, etc. That were also again scattered over there. And we know that this was still going on at the time of Elgin, because, for example, if you go into the Elgin room right now, the Duveen Gallery in the British Museum, you will see that there are two blocks that are joining with one figure that goes across both blocks that has been chiseled out. We know that figure because 10 years before Elgin took those marbles, the French consul, Louis Fauvel, made a cast of that particular block. In the space of 10 years, that figure had already been broken.
Wow.
And there are other bits and pieces where we have sketches from travelers and we try to find and make sense of them nowadays, and the pieces are just gone.
Yeah.
And some of this decay was going on even after Elgin. There was, for example, Byron. As soon as they go, Byron goes to visit Athens 10 years after Elgin. And he, at a certain point, he says in a letter, okay, we went with John Galt up on the Acropolis. And we went back some days after, and some pieces of the cornice of the Parthenon had fallen down in the meantime. So it's a process that is ongoing, and we know that even after Elgin, these pieces would have encountered the same fate. So Elgin packs up everything, and I'm cutting it short. It's a little bit longer.
It takes like around 10 years, isn't it? Like 10 years for him to
exactly. Yes, but the bulk of it gets sorted in the first 2 or 3 ship trips, and one of the ships that Elgin had used at boat for the Enterprise, the Mentor, actually goes down to the bottom of the sea next to the Isle of Kythera. And it takes 2 years to actually grab everything from the bottom and bring it back to the surface. Anyway, piece get shipped to Malta, and from Malta then they get shipped to London, and then Elgin starts building a little bit of a small museum in a way, because he needed to create a public case in a way for the marbles. So he needed to make everybody acquainted with these marbles and show them. Because there were already ongoing negotiations, we are in 1806 now. Elgin is going back 3 years after being captured by the French. He was going back from the embassy in 1803, but gets captured in the meantime, and therefore stays as a prisoner of war for 3 years. But still, as soon as he gets into London as a free man again, he basically has already started negotiations. And we have a record from the Speaker of the House of Commons, Charles Abbott, saying, I've spoken with the director of the British Museum, Mr. Planta, and we are talking about acquiring the marbles taken by Elgin from Athens. And also, Lord Elgin himself, for example, says quite clearly that he had always thought about the marbles to be of public property and for public utility. He says that in a letter to Lord Mulgrave in 1808. So he starts building a little private museum. Also, this is an important detail. The marbles get shipped to London, but they never go to Scotland, and yet Lord Elgin's house was in Scotland. This is to say that whoever says that Lord Elgin wanted to decorate his house with them is completely misguided, because had he wanted to, he could have shipped them to Fife, and instead he doesn't. He wants them in London because it's in London that they are supposed to be forever, because he needs to give them to the government, and that's the point. So he starts creating a little bit of a museum, a private museum with private admission, starts getting artists coming in and see them, and they start the popularity of these marbles starts ballooning, starts becoming a thing, the talk of the town in a way. What happens then is that in the middle of this process, Byron comes in and says he had just already attacked Elgin before going to Athens even, because they were two opposed political parties, and also Byron was going for the English side of his ancestry and instead was a little bit anti-Scottish, therefore yet another reason to be against Elgin. And also, Byron was a little bit pro-French in a way, which was a fashionable thing to do whenever you were a young intellectual, a lefty of the time.
It always is.
And
Still is.
so it was siding with the French and against the British, in this case Elgin. And so Byron starts writing these poems, the most famous of which is The Curse of Minerva, in which he publicly accuses Elgin. Obviously, anything that comes out of the pen of Lord Byron is a huge sensation in London's polite society. Everybody reads these poems, and everybody now starts having a little bit of an ambivalent position. There is another person that is also attacking Elgin, which is an art connoisseur, Mr. Richard Payne Knight. And Payne Knight was of the opinion, being the president of the Society of Dilettanti, he is basically he was of the opinion that these marbles were not classical, they were not Phidias, and they were Roman copies, and he dismissed that, obviously adding up to the opprobrium. So at this particular moment in time, Elgin is in a position where part of the artistic and the intellectual world sides with him. People like Keats, like Flaxman, like Benjamin West, etc. And part of this world instead sides against him. So the negotiation to give these marbles to the government now becomes more difficult. And some questions arise. Whether or not he got them legally, whether or not he got them in his personal capacity or as an ambassador, and whether or not they were actually what they were supposed to be, a product of Phidia, and in the first class of the arts, as they used to say back in the day. And then obviously the other question was, okay, let's assume that everything is the way Elgin says. How much should we pay for it? So Elgin himself asks Parliament to create a select committee and have a public inquiry. And this public inquiry, the select committee of Parliament, starts asking questions around, summons witnesses, listen to everybody, and produce a big report, which is published, and you'll find on Google Books if you want. And this report, published in 1816, says that Elgin acted legally. There was a permission. And also that he acted not in his quality as ambassador, but as a private citizen while he was ambassador there. Obviously, yes, being an ambassador gave him the contacts and the access, but he used it for his personal business, and therefore the marbles were not already crown property, as if he had acquired them as part of his ambassadorial duties, but they were actually his property, so the government needed to pay something. And some of the people that get interviewed by this commission were artists of the caliber, for example, of Canova and Antonio Canova, and basically the consensus becomes that they actually are products of 5th century sculpture and the best things they have ever seen, and they are really worth it. And they obviously, on one side, we are in 1816, the Napoleonic Wars have just concluded, the nation is depleted for money, people are really having problems finding food in the streets. There's a whole amount of people coming back, veterans, crippled, and depending on state pensions. So the state right now is trying to kind of cut down on the amount of expenditure, especially on things like this. Okay, it's a great opportunity, but we don't want to give Elgin £75,000, which is how much he says he has spent. We'll give him only 35. Now, this goes to Parliament. Parliament votes a decree, an act of Parliament, and this act of Parliament pays Elgin, authorized the payment to Elgin of the £35,000, and gets the marbles into the hands of the trustees of the British Museum. And they end up being in the British Museum ever since. Many people have seen these as diminishing the value of Elgin's enterprise. Some others say, okay, yes, if he had got them entirely legitimately, they would have given him the full price. There's all sorts of speculation. But there are elements that we can be entirely reasonable about, and we know for sure.
Yeah, so
What
that's
are
their
the
sort of
accusations?
that's sort of their history. That's how they got to British Museum now. So there's few things. Obviously, people say about like he didn't get the real permission because he got the permission from the occupiers rather than the Greeks themselves.
Yes.
So at that point, like I would personally myself say, well, the Ottomans had been there at that time for like around 300 years or so now. So
Yes,
so I mean, how would you get the permission from the Greeks of that area, anyways?
So
Right?
it's even more complicated than that, because first of all, what we need to think about is not the international law as it is right now, but international law as it was at the time of Elgin's. And the right of conquest was a thing back then.
Exactly.
It ended up getting away from international law and becoming illegal to conquer somebody and acquire territorial gains by a war of conquest only at the beginning of the 20th century. Before that, this was a thing, and it was in every manual, and you just could invade a neighbor and then get a peace settlement, or if you would defeat the neighbor, and then you would have no one left to make peace with, and so at a certain point the conquest would become settled, and there would be international recognition of the effects of this conquest.
And this was a settled consensus throughout the world. Like, this is how the operation of how it will work. This was a settled consensus. So it wasn't as if we can't see him from the like eyes of today, because he's working in the context of his time. So,
and
but
he basically,
when we talk about because the other point comes up as well, is that like his documents were not legal and stuff, or that he only had permission for people to sort of paint it or whatever, like, take paintings of it and not to take out of it. But you've already covered that point, that he had permission. It was Italian translation.
Yeah, so there is an element that we need to talk about when it comes to the definition of the international legal framework, because obviously people like Stephen Fry, for example, they have made the point that, Elgin was acting like if I had purchased the Tour Eiffel from Hermann Goering when the Nazis were occupying France in 1941. No, that's absolutely ludicrous for two reasons. First of all, because the occupation is as a temporary nature, a military occupation. You cannot have a military occupation, as you were saying, 343 years on, and still call it an occupation. The other thing is that occupation is different from conquest in international law terms because of the lack of a switch in allegiance from the people that are occupied. So the French in 1941 were still wanting to be French and refusing the Germans as an aggressor. While the people in Athens in 1801 were perfectly aware that their sovereign was the Sultan, and they needed to pay to them.
Nazi Germany had not been on France for like 300 years and established themselves as their rulers. Like, that had not happened. So the time frame, I don't think people realize, because I was going to oppose on that point, but I can't, because it's ludicrous, because the Ottomans had been there for that long, and there wasn't actually a state of Greece before that time anyways. There wasn't anything such as Greece.
Absolutely, but also the Ottomans got the city of Athens not from a Greek state, not from the Byzantine Empire, for example, but they actually conquered in 1458 the Duchy of Athens and Neopatra, which was a Latin crusader state that was established in Athens and the surrounding region, Attica and Euboea, in 1204, after the Fourth Crusade of 1204. So they were all territories that had been taken by the Crusaders off the hands of the Byzantine Emperor, and they had established all sort of microstates in a way, which were linked to the European powers. And the Duchy of Athens and Neopatra was ruled at the time of the conquest by a Florentine family, the Acciaiuoli. And Nerio Acciaiuoli, the last Duke of Athens, basically was defeated by the Ottomans in 1458 and then exiled and then killed. So therefore, this conquest is again a settled conquest. The Ottomans have a very good title in international law on the lands of Athens, and the lands of Athens and the region around, they were not politically Greek. Yes, obviously there were people that were speaking Greek and were Orthodox, but they were not Greeks in the sense that we attribute today to the world.
State. Yeah.
Exactly, they were not a nation state, and they won't be for another 400 years, up until 1821, 1832, when basically there is the uprising of these Orthodox Ottomans, that they start wanting a state. And there is a pivotal moment, actually, when they start creating a new identity, a new statual and national identity, which includes the going back from whatever they called themselves before, that was the Romans. They used to call themselves Romans because they were the Oriental Roman Empire, and they go back to becoming Hellenes once again, Greeks once again. This doesn't happen with Elgin when Elgin is there.
Yeah.
When Elgin is there, they have no knowledge whatever of what these antiquities are for. They have no knowledge whatever of what their connection with the ancient Greece is, and they have no interest whatever in preserving this cultural heritage, of which they don't even understand the value. There's a couple of travelers, British travelers, that annotate in their travelogues that, for example, the Greeks were attached to these antiquities as talismans, as things that had like demons in them and powers, supernatural powers. For example, when Edward Daniel Clarke takes a big statue of Demeter from Eleusis, the locals didn't want the statue to go away because they thought that this was the guarantee of the fertility of the soil. So removing the statue would make the soil infertile, not because it was a very ancient statue and had that importance to them as cultural identity. Not at all. Another case, when Elgin takes away the Sigean inscription, a very beautiful archaic inscription from the 6th century BC, and the locals again didn't want it to be taken away because they thought that touching it would cure ailments. It had thaumaturgic powers, and so all sorts of stories to demonstrate that there was not such thing as this cultural Greek identity connected to the antiquities, and this comes only later. And comes only later as something that is imported actually from the West for political reasons. And we can go there if you want and explain how these comes to be.
Before we go with it, so that was sort of the history of it. And Parthenon itself, it was a former temple on the Athenian Acropolis that was dedicated to the goddess Athena. I will do a short video of it, and by the time this video goes out, it should be here, so you can check it out. Like, I should put it somewhere up there. I'll also do a short episode on Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, and about his adventures and all of it as well, so people can catch that as well. Now, it's very important, like, to understand the history in its context as well, and also understand that maybe there might be some things that we are not aware of. So there could be things that Elgin did that we might not see as the correct things to do. Maybe he was reacting to it or was not reacting to it, many things. But now comes a point of giving them back to Greece. That has to be a bit detached by the history of what was happening to Elgin. A little bit, it needs to be detached, right? Because if they're asking for it back right now and they're saying they stole it from us, then, well, the argument is not there because it was a legal takeover from them, right? So they have to besmirch his name to make a case of getting it back. Well, on the other side, if he didn't had taken it back, they definitely would not have existed by now. They would have been, destroyed, because there was a lot of Muslims around that area who were actually destroying them because they were seeing them as, like, statues and stuff and idol worshipping or whatever, and they were destroying them. So, and people were taking bits and pieces of it, like you said, around that area to build their own homes and whatever, use them in their own places. So if the Greek authorities now want them back, right? So they have to make a separate case. Like, they have been asking for 200 years. So
That's also problematic.
Exactly, right? So
because actually go on.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, like, because you had been there, right? So you have studied around over there and stuff. Could you make a case that they would be better in their home now, right? So let's forget whether they were stolen or not, everything forgotten. and let's even forget like there is a Greece and there is Britain. Like let's just forget everything about that there's nations and whatever. There might be political interest or not political interest. Do you think that they would be better in their original home, or do you think that it forms it forms a more rich part of the story of what happened during the Ottoman time, which is why they are preserved in a British museum, and that should be a way of creating a shared history between Greece and Britain, rather than creating a wedge that they should be in the original home. But could you make a case that they could be in the original home?
So if they were taken from the ground in this very moment, like many things that get discovered right now, I would say yes, of course, they should go into a museum in Athens, because if you open up an excavation in Athens in the middle of a street because you want to put a cable or something, and you find sculpture of whatever nature, obviously what you do is it's beautiful, it's from Athens, it's been excavated by Greeks right now, it goes straight into one of the museums in Athens. But this is not the case, obviously, for this particular sculptures. The way they were acquired is part of the identity of these pieces themselves, it's part of their story. So if we want to be just in representing the history of these stories, of these items, we cannot say, you know what, part of the story I don't like, so I forget about, and this part of the story I like. That's all I'm interested about Phidias and the Acropolis in the 5th century BC during the Athenian Empire, and then this is the only consideration that I will have. Because this deprives the items of a fundamental part of what they are. Items like these are not beautiful pieces. They are not things that are valued for their aesthetic alone. Of course, they are beautiful and they are masterpieces of figurative art, but on the other side, they are also elements of an archaeology, elements of a past history of humankind.
Yeah.
Therefore,
A story of
all the
and
phases
also
of this
like considering
particular
that this
story.
uh, also considering that this story is actually continuous, that it hasn't ended. Just because Parthenon
Absolutely,
was made a
absolutely.
long time ago doesn't mean like this time of Ottoman Empire or this time right now as well, 300 years, 1,000 years from now would not be a part of history. So it needs to, because what I was thinking
Absolutely.
before we discuss the story of how it got here, right? My thinking was like, because you were studying over there and you would go out and see these things, would it not be even more remarkable to have them restored as they were before? But I think so that would take away the beauty of what happened in the middle, how fortunate it was that Elgin happened to be there and take this private enterprise, even though the government did not have the resources for it, and save it, right? It won't, and people would forget that part of the history because that is important.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's also a very interesting story in its own right, because whenever we say that, for example, classical civilization has a foundational role and a foundational importance for Western culture, we cannot divorce these from the acquisition of pieces of ancient sculpture from all over the Mediterranean, for example, and then their transport and their study and their popularization and their exhibition into the museums of the capitals of Europe. This is an interconnected story. It's part of it. We attribute that importance to these pieces because we recognize their value. But we recognize their value because we have spent so much in taking them. And vice versa, because if they had no value whatsoever for our culture, Thomas Burge would not even have bothered taking them. So
Exactly.
there is this side of the story, what they are in their new form as pieces, relics of classical civilization that get treasured and
Mm.
valued and studied and got inspiration from. All of this story is a British Western story as opposed to the Greek story that is the only one the modern Greeks care about.
Mm. Can I? Okay. Do you think it's part of people wanting to feel comfortable, right? um that they don't want to remember the 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 uncomfortable thing that happened in the history, in a way that they're trying to put a bandage on top of it, that era never happened, the Parthenons, like the Ottoman, never were here, and like this is a new history now. We're gonna put a bandage, and in few hundred years people will forget that this ever happened. And even though it might
This,
be a comfortable
yeah,
thought for us that they can feel like that, it's just not the truth.
absolutely, and I've also written about this particular aspect in other articles, because we are in a phase that basically Frank Furedi, for example, calls the war against the past. There is a situation where we are trying to, as a society, to distance ourselves from the past and say there are some actors, especially, that they are saying, no, okay, the past has no importance. It has no hermeneutical value for whatever it is that we are living now, doesn't allow us to explain the world, it's not useful anymore, and it represents values that are entirely rejected by modern society. Therefore, we shouldn't be glorifying the past, but we should just put things back the way they should have been. But this is an entirely anti-historical perspective. This is basically saying, I want to just rewind the clock of history and go back in time and do whatever Martin McFly was trying to do whenever he was in the movies with the time machine. And these has consequences. Just in the same way as breaking the space-time continuum has in those movies, these has consequences in our society, because we get entirely fictitious narratives right now being given to us by school and academia, where the past doesn't mean anything. The people in the past were all brutal, racist, and murderers, and colonialists, and imperialists, etc.,
Mm.
etc. And we shouldn't be talking about them. They are not useful for modern society. They are no longer examples that should lead. They should allow us to interpret the present and inspire for the future. So basically, we are in the situation where history is no longer magistra vitae, that is the teacher of life, but is something that it needs to be just put aside, and we should think about internet industry and I don't know, English, as opposed to thinking about Latin and Greek and the classics, which are no longer classic. They are no longer something that you look at as an example.
Mm.
So in this interpretational framework, what happens is the objects that are in our museum are no longer used to explain how it is that we are what we are, but they are weaponized and they are used to document a narrative. And this narrative is, as I said, something that is past, bad, and bad people, especially bad Western people, that were just
Mm.
going
Uh,
around like pirates and
yeah.
raiding everyone of their treasures.
Okay. Just to interject for now, we are having some issues with the internet, so I'm not sure like if there's some
Oh,
pieces of what you've said had been lost or not. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the video for now, and like start recording
yeah.
just the audio, so that like we can finish the end part of it and we don't miss anything, right? So I'm just going to. Right, so as you guys can probably see now, there would be no video but audio. So I've switched on to audio. So if in case we missed something because of the recording issues? I think so. We can just summarize it. The main point that we were trying to make was that history should be viewed in its context, and you cannot, because of how you feel comfortable or uncomfortable with things, you cannot just pick and choose what part of history you want to have, right? The uncomfortable parts come with the comfortable part, and they are supposed to teach us how we have got to where we have got to, and also which pathways we should be taking, what lessons we should be learning, so that we can map out our future. So in this case, if there is a thought that the Greeks, certain Greeks and certain academic people over here as well want to feel comfortable, and they don't want to view that whatever happened in that area in Athens during the times of Ottoman actually happened, well, it's a loss to the whole of the whole of history. It's a loss to the whole of, like, how would we learn that what happened during that time when they took over, what things that they shared, what things that Greeks took over from the Turks, and what did the Turks took over from the Greeks in their exchange, what was happening to the to the whole thing, to the marbles themselves in that area, and how they were recovered, why they were recovered, what was the role of Lord Elgin in this, why was there a need within the British to preserve things, right? To learn from it. All of this would be lost to us, and lost to the British history, lost to the Greek history. So to think about another way, like rather than saying, oh, whether they should be stay over here or remain in Greece, or have this sort of like culture war between both sides, is there is there a better, like, is there a third way that we can take, is there a way that we can take that no, they should be viewed as I was saying before, they should be viewed as a part of shared history, and they should remain in British museum and stuff, but maybe there should be more of a link, like some sort of like scholarships between both sides, so that they can learn from each other and more and share in that history rather than be against each other.
I think that there is a middle way, and there are actors
Oh, I can't hear
generally.
you.
Can't you?
Oh, I can hear you now. Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
go on.
So I think that there is a third way, and there is a medium way, and there are actors that are trying to bridge this gap, this monumental gap. The problem is that more often than not, you get these actors that are very busy with finding creative ways to compensate the British side for the eventual loss of the marbles, instead of saying,
Mm,
let's work authentically together in telling the story of the intertwined stories of our two cultures. What I think by that, what I mean by that is, for example, that both institutions, for example, the British Museum on one side and the Acropolis Museum on the other side, should tell the entire story of the marble, should show the entire figurative cycle of the Parthenon frieze, using replicas for each other's missing parts, but try not to brush aside the uncomfortable part of the story, which is on both sides, because obviously in the British Museum side right now you see the Elgin marbles we have, but you don't see the parts that are missing. If you enter into the viewing gallery, you might even have the idea that that's all of it. Instead, there is an entire half of the figurative cycle which is in Athens. The British Museum has copies, has casts of these sculptures, and they should be displaying them. They should be displaying the entire figurative cycle as it was perceived in antiquity, as it was looked at by all the passersby, and all the priests and priestesses of Athena during the Athenian festival, etc. Um, in Greece, on the other side, what they should be telling is the story of how this particular figurative heritage has been fertile ground for the arts of the Western world. And they should be proud of this particular function. They should not be protective and say, oh no, okay, that story is all bad. It's the story of the marbles gone away and taken. Therefore, I don't want to tell this story. Or even worse, tell it in a very biased and ideological way, as they are doing right now. So the third way is to embrace history as it was and not as some people would have loved it to have been, and start telling that story.
Yeah. And also, like, if we think about it, like, how people say, oh, they've been asking for 200 years and stuff. Well, if we look at the history of Greece, I've been to Crete as well, and a few other places as well. I can see that in those times, since they have been liberated, and since they have formed as a nation, they have had a bit of an up and down time. And there would have been many occasions where they would not have had the money, resources, or the inclination to protect these things. Even when I was walking in Crete, there were a lot of buildings and stuff which in Britain would have
I
been
know.
preserved, but you could clearly see like they don't have the resources to preserve them, right? So
Or they decide to use
if
the
Britain
resources in a
actually
different way.
spend that much, exactly, because they wouldn't have seen, and they wouldn't have seen it as like worthy of preserving, maybe, like, or just not the need for it. So maybe if they're saying, okay, we want Britain to give that back to us, oh, you can't say that unless you say, okay, we'll pay you for all the time from when you took it, preserved it, and took care of it. We'll pay you the cost of what it took you to have it, right? But they're not even having that discussion, because if they had that discussion, then I could have sort of entertained, right? Sort of entertained, okay, like, but you're paying for it, right? A, they can't afford that, but B, like, that sort of says, well, it's sort of like someone took care of your kid for that long time, right? Like a babysitter or something for for a whole month,
Yeah.
and then you say, well, give me my just back to me. Now I'm not gonna pay you anything, or like, you gotta be a bit reasonable.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a way, it's history. It's the way it went. And at a certain point, they should just put a lid on it and just say, okay, we accept the way it went, and that's the story that we are gonna tell in our museums because this is culture. And on the other
Mm,
side, if you don't do that, you enter in a very dangerous spiral where you start saying, I want things not because of the way history went and because the law of who the law says they should belong to, but saying based on ideology and saying, okay, I want things the way I would like them to be, or in the place where
yeah,
I would like them to be displayed. But the problem is, if we start doing likes, why you should have the things the way you like it and I shouldn't have it the way I like it. And this
exactly.
becomes a very pointless exercise at that point.
Yeah,
We
and
have,
you destroy
right,
things in the middle, don't you? Because every 4 or 5 years, when a new government comes in, a new thought comes in, then we keep changing that instead of actually
absolutely,
thinking of ways how we can collaborate on it, how we can actually learn from each other, how we can create programs where the Greek history and the British history and the preservation of it can be explained. The Greek students and archaeologists and stuff can actually learn how to preserve, how did British preserve this for so long. So many things that they can learn from each other. It's not saying like they don't know those things, but it's sort of like you actually get a bigger view. It sort of forms part of the classical history coming into the modern history, or like not the modern contemporary history, but the relatively modern history of the
yeah,
time of Ottoman Empire, and how it can translate into the contemporary history, right? There's a whole journey that we can learn from. And there's so many things they can do over there. They can take British help into, like, you could create some sort of holographic images as well to show like, oh, how it would have been in that time,
yeah.
right? That would be even more prominent. right? To say it.
Absolutely. And we are in a position now, technologically, to create a very good quality replicas. We are in a position to show the polychromy of ancient sculpture as it would have looked like. We have the position we're in a position to create the right museological environment for people to perceive these monuments the way the ancient would. And to do this in a dynamic way, because obviously even if we fixate ourselves only on the date these sculptures were born, we are actually telling
Mm,
only a little piece of the story of these sculptures. Because the story of, for example, the persistence of the sculptures during the phase when the Parthenon was converted into an Orthodox church is just as
yeah.
interesting, and is another story worthy of telling. And the story of these sculptures that were perceived as demon and magi
Mm,
and mythical creatures by the Islamic people that were living with them during the Ottoman phase. That's another history that is just as
mm,
interesting and is only now being started to be told by the studies. But again, we shouldn't be fixated only on one thing. Okay, Athens at the apogee of the Athenian Empire, that was the best of the best, and we selected that phase, and we just want to tell that story because that is the story, that's our story or their story, and we decided that's the only thing that we are talking about. And right now, the Greeks, unfortunately, are doing exactly this. They are saying the apogee of our ancient phase of life was Pericles and the Parthenon and the Acropolis Periclean program, and we built a museum that even in his physical appearance tells that story, because if you go into the Acropolis Museum right now, you start walking, you go through the archaic age, and then you go up and up and up and up, and even physically you are ascending to the
mm,
Parthenon Gallery at the very top of the museum, as if you were going to this parable of art, where you just go to the top of the best, and then you come down through Roman and Hellenistic times, as if Byzantine times, as if this was okay. Yes, that's the death of art and doesn't matter
mm,
anymore. And that's the vision of history. That is no longer the way history gets taught in even in school these days. Every phase of history is important. Every time in history has a dignity, and we should be telling all of those different histories because they all have a value to communicate, something to teach us.
yeah, I think so. Because I was going to ask you, like, what do you think the media don't doesn't understand? I think so. The media and academia, like, not that much of it, but media mainly. I think so. This is what they don't understand. History is not only what you agree with. History is not to be agreed
Yeah,
upon or disagreed upon. History
no, not
is
at
a
all.
like stories, oral stories, and facts, and whatever you can find archaeologically to support those stories and facts, right? And there might be things that you don't agree with, and there might be things that others would agree with, disagree with, and whatnot, but
Even even
we
even
have to take it
more
all.
even more, history is the history of people. So as soon as you
Mm,
start saying that the history, some history is more important than another,
yeah,
what you're actually saying is that some people are more important than some other people, which
exactly.
is entirely at odds and conflicts
Yeah,
with what you are always saying in other quarters, saying, oh no,
yeah,
okay, we are all equal and we are all with our dignity,
yeah,
etc. If we are all equal and with our dignity, why are you going around saying that history is more important, that your history is more important, that particular
yeah,
interpretation is more important, or that the Ottomans didn't have any right to give away what they gave away to Elgin? You are negating agency to other people in other parts of the chronological span. Because people in the past are just like people in different countries. There was a very famous
mm,
formulation of this concept where in a novel of 1953, I think, the author said the past is a different country. They do things differently there. And
mm,
that's the idea. That's the spirit, in a way. You should think about people in the past with the same dignity and respect as people in another country. So
Mm.
if the Ottomans back in 1801 decided in their own right that they wanted to give Elgin the marbles because it was convenient to them to do so, who are you to decide that they should
Mm.
not have? Who are
Yeah.
you to decide that they were wrong?
Mm.
You are doing a very if you do this kind of value judgment on the people in the past, you are basically putting yourself on a moral grandstand and telling people the way they should have behaved. But
Mm.
based on what? On your moral
Mm.
compass of
Yeah.
today, which is going to be rubbish in 200 years' time. So
Exactly.
and that's the big problem with these presentism, this idea that all the past is rubbish and not to be learned from, because on one side deprives us of the learnings from the past, and on the other side is basically putting us in a position where we are not conscious of ourselves being the past of the people that come after us.
Yeah.
So if we
Yeah.
teach people that the past doesn't have any importance, one day there will come somebody who tells us, yeah, you know what you thought about the Elgin marbles today is absolutely not important. And they will probably one day say, okay, yes, the pieces that have gone back to Athens will go back to Rome, back to Palermo, back to Heidelberg, in a counter movement, because there may be somebody that will privilege history again the way it was, not the way somebody in 2025 decides it should have been.
Yeah, and I think so. This is a good point to close the conversation as well. Um, Before we had the conversation, I was unsure of whether it should, like, I was actually more convinced because I like Greek mythology and stuff. I like Greece. I like Greek people as well. I like going over there. They're
Oh yeah,
nice people. And I was like, maybe it should be good. But as we were talking, I think so. I managed to convince myself after hearing you that you know there's better ways of doing things rather than looking at everything politically. And I forgot also, like, about that point, like, where Greece actually wants to whitewash that whole point of history, which I can understand it, because I hate the fact that the Ottomans came over and ruined that whole part, conquered it in the name of Islam, and ruined a huge area of Europe and stuff, and changed it to what it could have been. But it's not up to me to decide, like, whether it was a good thing or bad thing. It had to happen because it happened. So what are the lessons that we can learn from it, right? That is all that you can do from history. You can't rewrite history. It happened, and I can moan about it, I can cry about it, all the Greeks can cry about it, but it happened. There's no value in erasing it. Just like people try to erase the history of slavery as well, by just like saying, oh, I'm going to be uncomfortable, I'm not going to talk about how the Africans were actually selling other Africans, let's not talk about that, let's, like, just whitewash that whole. It
indeed.
doesn't work like that, because then we don't learn the lessons. So I think so it was really great having a conversation with you. I think so
Thank
I
you.
could have gone on about other things as well.
Oh,
I think so I would love to talk about the weights at some point. Yeah,
happy to.
about your thesis. I would love to read your thesis as well. Like, if I could get a copy of it, I would love to discuss that.
How's your
Yeah,
Italian?
yeah. Not good at all. I
Slight
will try.
inconvenience.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to find a way. I'll try to find a way to get, like, it translated or something. But yeah, till that time, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you
Thank you very
everyone
much
for
for having me.
listening.
Pleasure to be here.